So Mark 6, and then starting in verse 30. It's one of my very, very favorite stories. You guys, I know, have heard this many times. The story is the feeding of the 5,000. Let me just read through this, and then I'd love to go back and just talk about some of the things that are contained inside the story that took me a long time to really notice. But I think it's just some of the best things I've ever seen. So starting in verse 30, then the apostles gathered with Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourself to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to the deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran there on foot, and from all the cities, and they arrived before them, and came together to him. And Jesus, who had came out, saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep without having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, the disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. But he answered, so Jesus answered and said to them, no, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, well, shall we go out and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? But he said to them, well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they found out, and they said, we found 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to have them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when they had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to the heavens, blessed, and broke the loaves, and gave them. And his disciples had them set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all, so that they all ate and were filled. And they took up the 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. And now those who had eaten the loaves were about 500 men. You know, that's one of my very, very favorite stories, because wouldn't that have been amazing to be a part of that, to see some simple loaves of bread and fish be used to feed 5,000, and just to watch that miracle and to see how this food was replenished. You know, as we look, though, through that story, there's some very interesting things that take place, and I want to highlight some of those. The first thing that really stands out to me is this, is that when the disciples realized that the people were hungry, what's so fascinating to me is that here the disciples who had been with Jesus all this time, they had watched him perform miracle after miracle after miracle, and yet when they recognized this problem that people were hungry, do you notice the first thing that they did? Instead of asking Jesus what they should do, how they should solve this problem, isn't it interesting how they offer up to the Son of God, they offer up to Jesus a solution. No, we need to send them into the villages so that they can buy something to eat. And I just think that just so illustrates, human nature. That when I'm faced with a problem, so often, instead of going right to the Lord, right to him, asking him, what should I do, praying, waiting to see what he wants me to do. I mean, do you ever find that it's so easy for us to just try to solve that our own self? I remember one time I surprised my son. I have 4 children, so I have 3 daughters and a son, so please be praying for me. So I went to pick up my son. He was probably about 5 at the time, so he was just had started school, and so I had some extra time. I think I had a day off from work, or I don't remember exactly what, but I knew that I could pick him up. So I went to surprise him, and I showed up at his school, and I said, hey, son, I don't have to go back to the office, and so me and you, let's just hang out, son and dad, and we can do whatever you want. If you want to, we lived near some lakes and rivers at the time, and I said, if you want, we could go fishing, or we could go see a movie, or whatever you'd like to do. Let's just have some fun father-son time. And so I said, what would you like to do? And I'll never forget what he said. At the time, we lived in a very small town. And I think one of the ways that you know you live in a small town is when the opening of a car wash makes the newspaper. Okay, I grew up in very big, cities, and so it was a very different experience for my wife and I, our family. And so I said to my son, I said, what would you like to do? And he said, Dad, he goes, I would love to go to this new car wash. I said, really? So of all the things we could do together, fishing, movie, you want to go to a car wash? And he said, yes. And so I said, okay, fine. And so I figured, that'd take us, 10 minutes or so to get through that and wash the car, and then we could go do something fun. But as I pulled up, I kid you not, there were probably 50, 60 cars lined up out onto the street, all waiting to go into this car wash. And I'm literally thinking, where am I? I mean, why is this such a big deal? But of course, my son wanted to do it, so we got in line and we waited, and finally we made our way up, and I said, now Garrison, my son's name is Garrison, I said, now which wash should we get? Because there's kind of the basic, but I said, there's also the really fancy one, with all the stuff. And he goes, yeah, let's get the fancy one. So, I paid my $900, I'm sure, for the real fancy one. And we just waited and waited. And there were actually 2 lines of cars going through paying for their car wash. And so it looked sort of chaotic. It looked confusing to me. I didn't know how this was all supposed to work, but the 2 lines converged into one line, and then that led into the car wash. And so when we got right up, there was a guy sort of directing people in. And so I rolled my window down, and I just asked the guy, I said, I paid for the really fancy one. I said, this looks a little chaotic. I said, how do I know I'm going to get the right one that I paid for? So he's explaining something. It didn't make sense to me. But I just trusted him. So who's been to one of those car washes where you go drive right in? Have you guys done that before? So as I was sort of being pulled now into this thing, I went to roll my window up. And I went click, 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 and it would not roll up. As I'm being dragged into this car wash, my window is still down. And I'm panicking. I'm not sure what is going on. Why will this not roll up? But here we are getting sucked into this thing, and all of a sudden, the suds dispenser, the soap dispenser goes off, and it just goes, and it blows all this soap and suds into my car. And so, it's everywhere. I can't see. My eyes are stinging. And I know any minute that the big brush, the hot wax, whatever, is going to come flying in. And I still can't figure this out. Well, my son in the back, he's never been more excited in all his life, He yells out, Daddy, you made it snow, I'm like, no. And finally, I turned the car off and turned it back on. I finally figured out what the problem was, so I was able to roll the window up kind of at the last second. But for years, every time that we drive by that place, my son would say, hey, why don't we go on in and you can make it snow again, Daddy? So I said, listen, Abraham, killed his son or tried to or whatever. You better be careful. So, in so many ways, when we are faced with a problem, and we try to solve it on our own, sort of like that day with the car wash, we get this big face full of suds. And that's exactly what happened to the disciples, and sort of how Jesus responds. I love that when he talked about, no. When they offered this solution, he said, no. You go find the food. And in so many ways, I think the order what happens is instead of us trying to figure out how to solve our problems, right? Because we all have problems. We could go around this room, and I have no idea what you guys face. We all are facing something. We all have these problems every single day. But instead of us trying, first and foremost, to solve them on our own, I think what this part of the story illustrates is that God really wants us to surrender. It's funny when you look at the stories in the Bible. You see so many other great examples of how people tried to solve it on their own. Eve, when faced with the problem, what did she do? She ate the fruit. When Moses, after he killed the Egyptian, what did he do? He tried to solve it by running off into the desert. Jonah, when God asked him to go to Nineveh, what did he do? He ran away. David, when he killed, when he got in trouble with Bathsheba, what did he do? He killed her husband. And so there's just story after story that our default setting, I think, as humans, is that when faced with a problem, we try to solve it ourselves, when I think what God is really wanting from us is this idea of surrender. So at some point, as the disciples listened to God, they went out and they found what he had asked them to find, and they brought it to him. There's a surrendering of what they had to him that took place. And I think that is such an important part of this story, is the surrendering. But I don't know about you, but the idea of surrendering can be a little confusing. What does that really mean? Because I think in our culture, in our day and age, the movies that we watch, the stories that we read, surrendering is sort of when we put our hands up and say, I give up. I mean, it's almost that's the image, right, that we find of surrender. And yet I think it's very, very different than that. I remember one time when I was in secondary school, so I was probably about 14, 15, somewhere in there. And I had an opportunity. My parents sent me away for the summer to a family camp. Do you know what I'm talking about? A family camp. You kind of go away for the summer, and we had these counselors that would take care of us. We do all these kind of fun things. And so one of the things that I really was looking forward to was that we got to go to a cave. And as we went into the cave, we were able to do some climbing and rappelling. And all the boys in my cabin wanted to be the first one into the cave to where we could rappel and climb into this really cool part of the cave. And so as we were in the cave, there were probably 15, 20 of us boys, and we had our counselors there. And one of my favorite counselors, his name was Dave. And Dave was just this big, strong, huge American football player. Okay, that's what he did. Kind of like pastor, okay? It reminds me a lot of you, just that really big and strong, You hugged me and I could barely breathe, so just very strong, So that's the image right there, all right? So Dave was just this man's man, this big old strong guy, and so as we were in the cave, a buddy, one of my friends and I, we decided that we wanted to play a joke on Dave. And so we kind of ran up as everybody's going through the cave. We had our flashlights on, and so we ran way up far, and we hid behind a big rock, and we waited real quietly. So when Dave and the rest of the guys came by, we were going to scare him. And so we waited real patiently, and we could hear Dave, being all loud and obnoxious like he was, and as he came by, we jumped out and screamed as loud as we could, rah! And it scared him so bad that he did two things that I don't think he wanted to do in front of these other boys. Because we saw Dave was really tough and strong. And when we scared Dave, he screamed like a little girl, first of all. This high-pitched, squealing kind of scream that you never thought would come out of this big football player. So he screamed, but then he fainted. And so there Dave lay on the ground as my friend and I realized that we were probably in big trouble, right? And so as Dave came to and all the boys, we began to tease Dave. I wish I had paid more attention to something that Dave said as we continued to walk, and that was, "I'm going to get even." And so time went by, and now it came to the point in time where we came to the spot that we were going to get to kind of rappel, climb down into this other section of the cave. And so all of us boys wanted to be the first one, right? We wanted to be the first one to go down. And so we're all raising our hand, "Dave, pick me, pick me." So just take a guess. Who do you think Dave chose to be the first one down into the other part of the cave? Who do you think? Me. Can you believe it? How lucky. How lucky was I? I had no idea, though, what was in store for me.